The chamber hummed with expectation, the sort that lingers when a hearing feels ready to veer off script. Wooden Polish benches were lined with aides, reporters, and spectators, all eyes flicking between the senators on the dais and the witness table below. The tall ceilings and heavy drapes magnified every sound, papers shifting, a cough, a whispered aside. At the center sat Senator John N. Kennedy. His posture appeared casual, yet his eyes were alert, the look of someone seasoned by years of political battles. His suit was pressed, his tie a muted blue, and his expression carried the calm assurance of a man long at home in courtrooms and Senate halls. Across from him, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, widely known as AOC, leaned in, her hands tight around a pen. Determination sharpened her features, with just a trace of disdain slipping through. The tension between them was clear, a silent warning of the clash about to unfold. It began with a question designed less to inquire than to sting. AOC's voice cut through the air, clear, deliberate, and edged. "Senator," she began, her tone practiced and pointed. "I find it interesting that someone with your, shall we say, outdated law degree feels qualified to instruct us on present-day policy." The words landed like a jab, prompting murmurs from the audience. She let the remark hang, her gaze locked on Kennedy, as though daring a reaction. "No offense," she added, though her faint smirk told another story. "But a degree from a bygone era doesn't exactly scream expertise in today's world, does it?" The room held still. Reporters scribbled furiously, aides exchanged looks. AOC leaned back, convinced she'd landed a decisive blow. She had framed Kennedy as antiquated, his credentials dulled by time in a world moving too fast for him to keep up, but Kennedy didn't flinch. Not a muscle shifted. His face was calm, nearly serene, like a man who'd heard this sort of barb many times before and learned long ago never to bite. His fingers rested loosely interlaced on the table, eyes steady on AOC. The silence stretched, unsettling in its weight. What started as AOC's triumphant moment slowly began to feel unsteady. The crowd expected a sharp comeback, a flicker of irritation, something. Kennedy gave them nothing. His composure drained the sting from her attack, then, he tilted his head slightly, as if turning her words over. At the corner of his mouth, the faintest twitch, almost a smile, appeared. It carried the quiet confidence of a chess player who sees the winning move long before making it. Hearings here were often performances, senators tossing sound bites like sparring partners for the cameras. But this felt different. AOC's strike wasn't about policy, it was personal. She had questioned Kennedy's legitimacy itself, suggesting his time had passed, his education obsolete. For a moment, it landed. Younger aides gave discreet nods. Reporters drafted headlines framing it as AOC's latest takedown of the old guard. Yet Kennedy's silence began to shift the story. He didn't raise his voice or show frustration. Instead, he leaned forward and reached for a leather folder on the table. The motion was deliberate, steady, honed by years of courtroom rhythm long before the Senate. The folder was worn but refined, its edges softened with use. Opening it, Kennedy revealed neatly arranged papers, thumbing through them with the practiced ease of someone who had done it countless times. Still silent, yet projecting authority in every move. Noticing the balance shift, AOC pressed harder. "All I'm saying, Senator," she continued, "is the world has moved on. We need new perspectives, not people clinging to laurels from a degree earned back when typewriters were still in use. A few chuckles rose, but the laughter was hesitant, uncertain, like the room itself sensed the tide turning. Kennedy's silence was no longer a pause, it had become its own statement. At last, he drew a single sheet from the folder and lifted it. No theatrics, no sweeping gesture, just a quiet display. The page was clean, official, stamped with the seal of a federal court. He didn't read from it, didn't need to. Its mere presence redirected the room's attention, pulling it away from sharp words and toward something more concrete. For a moment, a flicker of confidence crossed AOC's face, but it faded as she realized she might have underestimated her opponent. Kennedy spoke at last, his voice low, steady, and touched with the warmth of a Louisiana drawl congresswoman. He began, pausing just long enough for the room to lean in. "I don't believe my degree is what's at issue here." The words were simple, yet precise. He didn't raise his tone, didn't move with drama, but his presence filled the chamber all the same. Reporters stopped typing. Staffers went quiet. Even AOC stilled, her pen hovering above her notes. Kennedy's gaze never shifted. He wasn't merely countering her remark, he was preparing to reframe the entire exchange. The room leaned closer, sensing the shift. His calm wasn't retreat. It was the assurance of someone who had faced harder trials and endured. He slid the paper back into the folder, closing it with a soft snap that echoed in the hush. "What I've found," he continued, his voice measured, "is that it's not the age of a degree that matters, but what you do with it." It wasn't loud or flashy, but the statement carried weight, like the strike of a gavel. A few in the audience nodded, and a quiet ripple of agreement moved through older attendees who knew that lived experience often outweighs bravado. AOC opened her mouth to respond, but Kennedy pressed on. He leaned back, composed yet alert, like an attorney pacing through a closing argument. "You see," he said evenly, "I've spent my life working for people who don't care what's printed on a diploma. They care about what's done in their name." The shift was subtle but decisive. He moved the exchange away from personal jabs and toward a larger point: service, results, responsibility. What had begun as AOC's sharp challenge was now Kennedy's moment of grounded authority. He refused to play her game, steering the debate onto his terms. The hearing rolled forward, but the energy had changed. AOC's early assurance had dulled. Her notes seemed more like a defense than a weapon. Kennedy, meanwhile, stayed steady, his folder resting on the table like a quiet signal of more to come. Reporters no longer fixated on a sound bite. Their attention turned toward him, waiting for his next move. Staffers whispered about the paper he had revealed. Was it a ruling? A case record? Whatever it was, it had centered the focus on the senator from Louisiana. As the session continued, the moment hung in the air. AOC tried to recover with detailed policy questions, but the sharpness of her earlier critique was gone. Kennedy answered each calmly, direct, clear, and grounded in practical knowledge of the law. He didn't rely on spectacle. His steadiness carried its own force. Gradually, the audience began to see more than just a senator. They saw a man seasoned by decades of work, one who had faced doubt before and would face it again without wavering. The confrontation was far from settled. AOC wasn't about to yield. But Kennedy had already shifted the ground beneath her, absorbing her challenge and turning it into an opening to define himself, through patience, not theatrics. The folder on the table, the composure in his tone, and the sharpness in his gaze all signaled that this was only the beginning. Whatever came next, Kennedy was ready. Prepared, and everyone in the chamber sensed it. The room still carried the tension of the earlier exchange, heavy with unfinished questions. The polished mahogany table in front of Senator John Neyer Kennedy reflected the outline of his leather folder, which now commanded nearly as much attention as the man himself. Kennedy sat with practiced ease, his hands resting lightly on the folder, his eyes steady but approachable, like someone long used to trusting instinct in high-stakes debate. Across the dais, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez held her pen tighter, a subtle sign of unease. She had landed her first jab, dismissing Kennedy's law degree as obsolete. But his steady reply, and his refusal to be rattled, had shifted the tone. The audience sensed it too, conversations fading as they waited for the next move in this pointed exchange. Kennedy's silence wasn't hesitation, it was strategy. Decades in courtrooms had taught him that patience and preparation often outlast quick words. Now, in the Senate chamber, he applied the same discipline with greater stakes. He opened the folder again, the soft creak of leather cutting through the quiet like a signal. From it, he drew a single sheet, crisp, embossed with the seal of a federal court. He didn't wave it or raise his hand. He simply set it on the table, letting its presence command attention. Reporters froze mid-sentence. Staffers leaned forward. AOC's eyes flicked toward the document, her expression steady but betraying a flash of concern. "Congresswoman," Kennedy began, his Louisiana drawl slow and deliberate, "you mentioned my degree earlier. I imagine you think it's not much to look at. But let me tell you about a case from a few years back." His voice stayed calm, almost conversational, but every word carried weight. He glanced at the paper, not because he needed to read it, but to draw every eye toward it. "This," he said, "is a letter from Judge Margaret Allison of the Fifth Circuit. She wrote it after a case I argued. One of those complicated matters where the law isn't just text on a page, it's a lifeline for people with nowhere else to turn." He paused, locking eyes with her. "She didn't care when I earned my degree. She cared how I used it." The letter, as Kennedy described it, was more than paper. It represented years of work. Without boasting, his words traced the story: a small business nearly destroyed by overregulation, a case hinging on an obscure precedent. Kennedy, then a practicing attorney, spent months gathering evidence, questioning witnesses, and crafting an argument that balanced logic with humanity. Judge Allison's letter praised his clarity, his skill, and his ability to make complex issues understandable without losing depth. It was recognition earned by persistence, not by the age of a diploma. AOC tapped her pen, searching for footing. "That's a nice story, Senator," she replied sharply. "But one case doesn't make you an authority on today's issues. The world has changed. We need leaders who understand the present, not just the past." It was a calculated pivot, steering the discussion back to her point about forward-looking solutions. Younger aides nodded, and reporters resumed typing, sensing a headline-ready soundbite, but Kennedy wouldn't bite. He leaned in slightly, his gaze firm but calm, the look of someone who had survived tougher battles. "Congresswoman," he said evenly, "I don't claim to know everything about today's world. But I do know this. The people I work for, farmers, small business owners, teachers, don't care what's fashionable. They care about what's true. And truth doesn't expire with a degree." The words landed softly but firmly, like a stone dropped into still water, rippling through the chamber. A few attendees exchanged nods. A quiet murmur of agreement spread among older members who understood the point. Kennedy wasn't just defending himself. He was pointing to something broader, an idea that resonated with anyone ever dismissed for their age, background, or credentials. He pressed on, his voice steady but richer now, drawing the room further in. "That case I mentioned," he continued. "It wasn't about me. It was about a man who poured everything into his small business, only to see it nearly lost to rules he never wrote. I spent long nights digging through books, not to prove I was clever, but because I knew what was at stake for him." Kennedy paused, letting the human weight of the story settle. "I didn't need a new degree to understand his struggle. I needed to listen, and to fight for what was right. That's what I've done my entire life. And I don't intend to stop." The room fell silent. Even AOC stilled, her pen motionless, eyes fixed on the table. Kennedy's account wasn't just about one case. It stood as a reflection of a career built on preparation, persistence, and showing up when it mattered most. He didn't rattle off credentials or boast about every win. The letter from Judge Ellison was proof enough. The audience felt the change. Attention had shifted from AOC's jab to Kennedy's grounded resolve. Reporters who had been ready to declare AOC victorious now scribbled notes on his quiet but forceful reply. Staffers whispered, some pulling out phones to search for the case he cited. Curious about the man who turned one letter into a moment of authority, AOC tried to pivot again, her tone edged with frustration. "Senator, I respect your experience," she said. "But we're talking about systemic issues, not just one person's story. We need bold ideas, not old cases." It was a fair point, but lacked the sting of her opening attack. Kennedy's calm delivery had blunted her edge, grounding the debate in tangible stakes and tested action. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a slow sip of water, letting the silence stretch, the pause itself carrying weight. When he spoke, his tone remained even. "I hear you, Congresswoman. But systems are made of people, and people deserve someone who will fight for them, not just talk about them." The line was simple but sharp, reframing the debate once again on his terms. The hearing carried on, but the moment lingered. Kennedy's leather folder stayed in front of him, a quiet promise that more evidence, and more resolve, remained inside. AOC's notes turned into hurried scribbles, her confidence tempered by the realization she had misjudged her opponent. The audience was captivated. Their attention was no longer on a single exchange, but on the senator who had turned an attack into opportunity, not through spectacle, but by standing firmly on the truth of his work. Kennedy wasn't just defending himself, he was shaping the next stage of the debate. The Senate chamber buzzed with restrained energy, the kind that builds when a confrontation edges toward something larger. Toward something enduring. The polished wooden dais, the watchful faces, the faint scratch of reporters' pens, all carried the weight of Senator John Neal Kennedy's steady response to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's opening challenge. AOC had begun the exchange with sharp criticism, mocking Kennedy's law degree as a relic from another era, a jab meant to brand him outdated in a world calling for new ideas. But Kennedy, with his calm Louisiana drawl and a single letter from a respected federal judge, had already shifted the balance. His leather folder, resting quietly on the table, had become a symbol of preparation, hinting there was more inside. Reporters, staffers, and spectators leaned forward, eyes moving between Kennedy's unshaken composure and AOC's controlled but rising frustration. The stage was set for a contest that would linger in memory. Sensing the need to recover ground, AOC straightened in her seat, gripping her notes as if to anchor herself. "Senator," she began, her voice cutting through the low murmur of the chamber, You keep talking about your past, your cases, your old methods. But we're in a new era. The challenges we face, climate change, inequality, technology, demand bold, forward-thinking solutions, not stories from decades ago. Her words were deliberate, meant to recast Kennedy as stuck in the past. Younger aides nodded in approval, their phones buzzing with drafts of tweets ready to amplify her point. Reporters wrote quickly, sensing a headline. For a moment, it looked as though AOC might seize the momentum back, her passion reminding the room why she was considered one of Congress's most influential young voices. But Kennedy stayed composed. His posture was relaxed, hands resting lightly on the table, his eyes steady on AOC. Not defensive, not hostile, simply calm, the air of someone who had weathered harder storms and knew where the discussion was headed. Reporters waited for a soundbite. Kennedy gave none. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, meeting AOC's gaze with quiet confidence. "Congresswoman," he said, voice measured and firm, "I don't claim to know everything about today's world. But I do know this. The people I represent, farmers, small business owners, teachers, aren't worried about what's fashionable. They care about what's true. And truth doesn't expire with a degree." The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the chamber. Older members nodded, and a soft murmur of agreement passed among them. Kennedy wasn't just defending himself. He was speaking to something larger, an idea familiar to anyone who had ever been underestimated because of background or credentials. His voice deepened, drawing the room further in. "That case I mentioned, it wasn't about me. It was about a man who put everything into his small business, only to see it nearly lost because of rules he never wrote. I stayed up nights studying the law, not to prove I was clever, but because I knew what was at stake for him." Kennedy paused, letting the story's weight settle. "I didn't need another degree to understand his fight. I needed to listen, and to stand up for what was right. That's what I've done my entire life. And I don't plan on stopping now." The chamber went still. Even AOC paused, her pen motionless, eyes on the table. Kennedy's account wasn't just one legal victory, it reflected years of showing up when it mattered. He didn't parade credentials or list successes. The letter from Judge Ellison was proof enough. The audience felt the shift. Reporters who had expected to crown AOC the winner now scribbled notes on Kennedy's quiet authority. Staffers whispered, some pulling out their phones to look up the case he referenced, curious about the senator who had turned a single letter into a symbol of credibility. AOC pressed again, her tone edged with frustration. "Senator, I respect your experience. But we're talking about systemic issues, not just one person's story. We need bold ideas, not old cases." It was a fair point, but lacked the sting of her first attack. Kennedy remained calm, taking a slow sip of water before replying. "I hear you, Congresswoman," he said, voice even. "But systems are made of people. And people need someone who will fight for them, not just talk about them." The line reframed the debate, sharp in its simplicity. The hearing moved on, but the moment lingered. Kennedy's leather folder remained on the table, a quiet promise of more substance within. AOC clutched her notes, trying to steer the discussion back. "Senator," she said again, her voice cutting through the hum, "you keep leaning on your past, your cases, your old methods. But today's problems, climate change, inequality, technology, require new solutions, not stories from decades ago." Once more, aides nodded, tweets drafted, momentum seemingly within her grasp. Yet Kennedy didn't flinch. His posture held, steady and relaxed, his expression calm. The room absorbed the weight of his silence. It wasn't hesitation, it was calculated patience. Kennedy tilted his head slightly, the faintest suggestion of a knowing smile touching his face. "Not smug, just measured readiness." "Congresswoman," he said at last, his Louisiana drawl threading through each word, "you're right that the world changes. But one thing never does. People should mean what they say, and say what they mean." The chamber fell quiet, breath held. AOC's eyes fixed on him. Her eyes narrowed. The pen in her hand paused, sensing a shift. Kennedy's words were more than a rebuttal, they were a setup. With a small nod, he signaled to an aide, who handed him a tablet. Kennedy tapped the screen, and the display behind the dais flickered to life. The audience leaned in as a video began to play. The footage showed a crowded fundraiser, filled with donors and supporters. Every line was delivered with precision. AOC's unmistakable voice filled the room, strong and sure. "I've worked with people who fought their way up," she declared. "Folks who went to night school, who earned their degrees through sweat and sacrifice. They're the ones who bring real perspective, who can outwork anyone from a fancy university. The clip ended on her smiling face, pride unmistakable. Kennedy let the silence stretch. Reporters exchanged quick glances. Staffers whispered. The weight of the moment spread through the room. When he finally spoke, his tone was steady. "Congresswoman," he said evenly, "that sounds a lot like the kind of story you were just criticizing. People who work hard, who earned their place through grit and determination. People like me, who got a law degree the hard way, not handed to us." A quiet, stern move through the chamber. In a single move, Kennedy had revealed the contradiction, without raising his voice. AOC had dismissed his degree as outdated, yet here she was celebrating the very struggle he had endured. Reporters typed furiously, headlines already forming. Kennedy turns AOC's words against her. On social media, clips spread instantly, many praising Kennedy's preparation and restraint. One viral post read, "Never challenge a lawyer who knows your playbook." AOC pushed back, her hand motioning with emphasis. "Senator, you're twisting my words. I was talking about people who bring fresh ideas, people adapting to today's challenges, not just old credentials." It was a strong recovery, but the room sensed momentum shifting. Kennedy waited for her words to fade before responding, almost gentle. "Congresswoman, I'm not twisting anything. I'm holding up a mirror. You said it yourself, hard work matters. So let's focus on the work, not the noise." The chamber stirred again. Kennedy's calm authority had turned a personal jab into a broader reflection on integrity. AOC scribbled frantically, her notes devolving into hurried lines as she tried to steer the discussion toward policy. Kennedy answered each point with the same clarity, always grounding his remarks in the law and its real-world stakes. But it was clear, the moment belonged to him, the video, the judge's letter, his steady composure. Together they reframed the debate. Kennedy no longer seemed like a relic of the past but rather a figure of substance, someone who earned respect through steady action. Online, reaction surged. "Kennedy plays chess while AOC plays checkers," read one trending post. Others framed it as a lesson in preparation and leadership. Reporters drafted stories calling the exchange a turning point. Staff whispered about Kennedy's reputation for always arriving with a strategy ready. Though the hearing moved forward, the atmosphere had shifted. Kennedy sat composed, his leather folder still closed, still a quiet signal of readiness. AOC, though still formidable, now carried the weight of her own words. Leaning forward, hands clasped, Kennedy addressed the room with the same measured tone. "We've talked plenty about degrees and qualifications," he said, scanning the chamber. "But here's what I've learned. It's not the paper on your wall that defines you. It's the work you do, the people you serve, and the truth you hold to when things get difficult." The room stilled once again. Reporters paused mid-sentence. Staffers stopped typing. AOC sat motionless, absorbing his quiet authority. Kennedy didn't gloat. He let the silence carry his point. Instead of pressing further, he shifted toward something broader, something beyond politics. "I've met people all across this country," he continued. "Farmers who've lost crops to bad policy. Small business owners struggling to stay open. Parents working 2 jobs so their kids can have a chance. None of them asked where I studied. They asked if I'd listen, if I'd fight for them. And that's what I do every single day." His words were calm but carried conviction. Kennedy wasn't only defending himself, he was speaking for anyone who had been underestimated, dismissed, or told they didn't belong. The room felt it. Staffers who had worked their way into these halls. Reporters who had started at small-town papers. Onlookers who had fought for their own voices to be heard. Kennedy's message was unmistakable. Worth is measured not by credentials or titles, but by impact. He paused, letting the silence underscore his point, his gaze moving deliberately across the chamber as if to draw each listener into the story. AOC broke the quiet, her voice sharper now, edged with defense. "Senator, no one's denying your hard work. But we're talking about systemic change, big ideas that move us forward. That's what people need now." It was a fair argument, one that might have carried more weight earlier. But Kennedy's calm presence, his preparation, and his ability to reflect her own words back at her had shifted the center of gravity in the hearing. Her statement now sounded less like a solution and more like a slogan searching for substance. He waited, letting the last of her words fade before speaking. "Congresswoman," he began, gentle yet firm, "big ideas are only as good as the people they serve. And serving people starts with listening, with showing up, with doing the work, even when no one is watching. The crowd leaned in. Their attention, once drawn to AOC's sharp delivery, now rested on Kennedy's steady substance. He didn't raise his voice, and he didn't rely on theatrics. His story carried its own weight. When I was a young lawyer, he continued, leaning back slightly with both hands resting on the table, I took on cases no one else wanted. Clients who couldn't pay much. People written off. I didn't do it for applause or headlines. I did it because it was right. And whenever someone told me I wasn't good enough, I let my work speak for me. The words were simple, but they carried quiet force, a reminder that a life's work is built not on privilege or posturing, but on a relentless commitment to doing what's right. Kennedy's gaze swept the room, his tone softening but no less steady. That's what I want people to remember, he said. It's not about where you studied, or what's printed on a diploma. It's about what you do with what you have. It's about showing up, day after day, and fighting for what's true. The chamber stayed still, the weight of his words settling like a call to action. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing they had just heard the kind of quote that would ripple through headlines and feeds. Staffers nodded quietly, some visibly moved, as though Kennedy's words reflected their own journeys. Even AOC, still composed, seemed to recognize the shift. Her earlier attacks now felt like a distant memory. Kennedy wasn't finished. He rested his hand on the leather folder, not to open it, but as a grounding gesture. I don't need anyone to tell me my worth, he said evenly. I don't need a fancy title or a degree from a big-name school. What I need, what we all need, is belief in justice, in doing right by the people we serve. That's what drives me, and that's what I'll keep doing, no matter who tries to tear me down. The statement struck with the quiet force of truth, not volume. Murmurs spread through the crowd, some clapped softly, others whispered about the senator who had turned a personal critique into a universal principle. The hearing moved forward, but the moment remained. Online, clips of Kennedy's remarks spread quickly. Hashtags about integrity and resilience trended within minutes. Kennedy schools AOC without raising his voice. One tweet read, shared thousands of times. Another called him the quiet giant of the Senate, a nod to his ability to command a room through preparation and principle alone. Reporters began shaping stories that framed the exchange as a masterclass in turning the tables, not through anger or ego, but with preparation, truth, and service. The lesson was clear, one that stretched beyond the chamber and beyond a single political clash. Kennedy's story reminded everyone that real strength isn't measured by who shouts the loudest or strikes the hardest. It's measured by showing up, doing the work, and holding fast to what's right, even when the world says otherwise. For young staffers, it was a call to persist despite obstacles. For reporters, it was proof that substance still mattered. For onlookers, it was a reminder that respect isn't tied to credentials, but to conviction. As the session wound down, Kennedy leaned back, his folder untouched, his work complete. AOC pressed forward with questions, her passion intact but her momentum dulled. The audience watched her, but their eyes kept returning to Kennedy, the man who had turned doubt into a lasting lesson, and that lesson was not about winning a debate. It was about integrity, about proving worth through action, about leading with quiet courage. It was a message for everyone in the chamber, and the millions watching beyond it. True leadership doesn't need a podium. It only needs the strength to stand firm and let the work speak for itself.